We got another good topic here because this was one of the topics that created the most debate and dissension in GOP ranks during the Trump years, and that was trade policy. A lot of conservatives are oriented towards free trade, and a lot of conservatives and free traders, free market types, saw the use of tariffs and other restrictions in trade as anathema to their free market sensibilities. Although they're definitely, even if you're a free trader, even if you're in like the Hayekian sense, it is difficult to argue. I've come to conclude, and many others have too. It's not just me. Difficult to argue that what we thought we were doing by bringing communist China into the global community, conferring MFN status, most favored nation trading status, that we were going to liberalize President Xi and company. And in point of fact, it's impossible to argue that that has occurred. What we've done, really, in retrospect, is underwrite the rise of China to a large degree, haven't we? So it's a complicated discussion, which is why we're pleased to be joined by Robert Lighthizer, who is President Trump's U.S. Trade Representative. His new book, No Trade is Free, Changing Course, Taking on China, and Helping American Workers. Robert Lighthizer, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I got to say, paging through your book, I didn't like seeing a Keynes quote there before the table of contents. But, I get the point about changing facts and changing your mind and so forth. The impact you think that the approach to China had, the use of tariffs had on the American economy during the Trump years?
Well, let me say first of all, in this analysis, one has to start with the proposition that China is an existential threat and a hostile adversary, right? Because if they're not those things, if they're not trying to stop the American dominance of the world, if they're not an opponent, then you have one direction you go in. So let's assume that we've started with the proposition that we understand how bad they were and how foolish that policy from the 90s that you alluded to, this notion that if you transfer enough wealth from America to China, that they'll become like Switzerland. The communists are going to become like a bunch of, burgers in Geneva, right? So that was complete nonsense. So once you do that, then the question is, how do you change? How do you stop, to sort of use Churchill's analogy, feeding the crocodile that's going to eat you? And that's basically what we're doing right now. We're transferring huge amount of wealth. They're stealing technology. We're literally building the biggest army in the world, and it is in China, the biggest navy, and it is in China. So we have to do something to stop it. And what President Trump did was begin that process. I call it strategic decoupling, not just total break off of everything, but you can have some trade with them, but it has to be balanced so that you're not net transferring money to them. It can't be in technology so that you're not allowing them to steal the technology, and it has to be in the interest of the United States. So those tariffs and that phase one agreement, which China ended up not keeping, were really, really an important, I say, a monumental change in direction and a beginning. This is another Churchill quote. This is not the end or even the beginning of the end. This is the end of the beginning. What he did was what Trump did was the beginning of a whole new policy. Until now, I was hopeful that the Biden people would keep most of it. Now I have complete faith in them. I think they are, for whatever reason, they either don't understand the nature of the crisis or they're playing some other game. I don't know which it is, but all of their recent actions and words have been very conciliatory to China at a time when China is becoming more and more and more and more aggressive towards us. So it's a sign of weakness, and it's not some, if you look at history, being weak in the face of aggressive militaristic dictator has not paid good benefits in the past.
Well, but just on the issue of premise, you start from the premise that China is a existential threat to the country, and that drives different trade policies than it would with a country that's seen as an ally and maybe a competitive but also collaborative. Well, okay, but if that's true, then explain the use of tariffs against some of our Western allies that also occurred during the Trump years.
All right, so let's sort of set aside the question of China right now, and let's talk about trade policy generally. You made the point that, well, which I hear from time to time, that a lot of conservatives consider themselves to be free traders. Well, I consider myself to be a conservative, but I'm certainly not a free trader. And I look at the essence of what free trade is about. It's about consumption. It's about materialism. It's not about the same as what conservatives are about, which is maintaining values and the institutions that are of most benefit to Americans. And if you look back at like Alexander Hamilton was no free trader, and many people would say he's the father of American conservatism. You look at the 12 presidents who were Republicans, Lincoln, who was the first, all the way through to Eisenhower, none of them were free traders. They all believed in using tariffs. You look at Ronald Reagan, the libertarians said Ronald Reagan was the most protectionist president since Hoover. They hated his trade policy. And then you look at President Trump. So I don't think that it's necessarily true that conservatives are free traders. And I think really the essence of being a conservative is quite contrary to the essence of free trade. We're about production and values and families and institutions that benefit community. We're not about consumption and optimizing prices and corporate profits.
But I mean, you would. Well, I'll just ask the question. I don't know what you'll concede, but you would also, part of that being about the family is about increasing the purchasing power of the family. And if, as Bastiat said, you look at all of these transactions through the eyes of the consumer, then, the idea of comparative advantage and reducing the costs of goods that have substitutes for the American family, that's a positive byproduct. I'm not saying it exists in a silo, but you would have to say that's a positive byproduct. You want competition to reduce the price of goods and services to increase the purchasing power of the American family.
Well, so I would say we don't have there's something to what you say. I don't want to dismiss it, but would just say I don't think we have a too little consumption problem in America. Our problem is too little production. Our problem is that people don't want to, that people don't work. You don't get the intrinsic value of work. That's where our problem is. And I would say, sure, if all things are even, I'd rather have a cheaper this or a cheaper that. But I don't want to do it if it means that at the margin I'm going to lose communities in Chicago because their television set is $10 cheaper. You follow what I mean?
No,
These are not logical. For a conservative, they're not logical trade-offs.
No, I do, but the problem comes in, the complication comes in the central planning. I mean, we were talking to Steve Moore earlier in the show about the bankruptcy of Lordstown Motors, which was, touted as a wonderful thing that happened to a business brought to a community in Ohio that was struggling. And, everybody wants to see those businesses succeed. But the idea that central planners pursuing industrial policy have, superior knowledge to the general marketplace, that doesn't bear out oftentimes. And so while it's, it's sort of like that's good in theory, too, that the idea you want to protect communities, not just go for the lowest common denominator, the lowest price. But oftentimes you end up just making the wrong call, as we see in Lordstown.
Look, for sure, to the extent we can, we want to bow to the market on these things. And we have plenty of competition in the United States and with allies. We don't need it with China. So, least of all, unfair competition. But let me just, and I agree with Steve on the point about Lordstown. So let me just state that outright. But if that is proof that central planning doesn't work, all right, which is kind of the assumption you're making, then I would just point out that the biggest car companies in the world, by far, the biggest production, the biggest export, the biggest everything, are all in China, and they're all centrally planned. So don't be careful how far you go with one example of a clearly a mistake in Lordstown, because
Well, yeah, but I mean, because they're centrally planned in China doesn't mean that's a model we want to adopt. Doesn't mean that the Chinese are
sure, that's true.
producing a superior product, and the cost they're imposing on, I don't know, Uyghur Muslims. That's not a road we want to obviously go down either. So the way that China does it is not something to emulate, as I know you agree.
No, I do agree with that. But I'll give you another example. And once again, all I'm saying is these things are nuanced. They're not cut and dry like some people like to think.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that Airbus would exist if it wasn't for government? It's like the biggest plane manufacturer in the world. It wouldn't exist except for the fact that a bunch of countries, 4 countries got together and just sort of created it. So you can do this stuff. You have to be careful. I agree with you completely. Your first instinct has to be, let's let the market do it. But if you're in a position, for example, like semiconductors, where you find China is investing $500 billion in it, Europe is investing $300 billion in it, Japan is investing $250-300 billion, and Korea is investing $200 billion. You can't then, in that case, say, no, we're not going to do that, because that violates the market. What you will end up with is you'll be a colony. All you'll do is have, you won't have any technology. So both extremes are wrong. Both do it all the way China does it, but do it not at all, that's wrong too. And what we have to do is figure out a smart way to do it in the middle.
If you were advising the next Republican nominee for president, what do we do with China, maybe with respect to trade policy, that would exacerbate the internal contradictions in any communist country, including China? What would be a couple of, here are 3 concrete things, 1, 2, 3, 4 concrete things we could and should do prospectively with respect to China that could have an impact to benefit American manufacturers and consumers, frankly, in the next regime?
So I have a whole bunch of them in the back of the book, a lot of specifics. But I would say the most important single thing is we have to stop feeding the crocodile that wants to devour us. And that means, one, you have to put tariffs on, particularly things like technology, which we did, but high enough to get to balanced trade. In other words, we have to get rid of that. It's officially $380 billion trade deficit that we shift to them. But it's probably unofficially, because of some stupid bookkeeping in the United States, probably closer to $500 billion. We have to put in place tariffs to raise those prices. Now, will that translate into cost to our consumers? In some cases, not at all, because we put them on. You just buy it someplace else, or it'll come to America. Short term, maybe a small effect, but I would say it's worth it once you realize the nature of the problem. So I would put tariffs on to get the balanced trade. The second thing I would do, I would begin the process of disentangling all technology from them. We can't have, if we're going to go to war with them at some point, we can't have them, know where all our tanks are and all our airplanes are, because their chips and their material are in all those things now, and that's insanity. So we really have to disentangle the technology. And then the third thing I think we have to do is restrict investment from the United States into China, which is all done to benefit China. So they basically, the Chinese make the decision, this or that rich guy can get a little richer, but it's going to help me, China, more. We have to restrict all that and restrict their investments in the United States, which are largely designed to get an economic advantage for China, to get data, and to get technology. So if you did those things, and by the way, if you stop the transfer of wealth in China, what effect will that have on China? It's basically the amount of money we're transferring is basically the amount of economic growth they have. It would put real pressure on the Chinese Communist Party.
It would put be a lot of bad news to the Biden family, but I digress. Robert Lighthizer, Trump administration, U.S. trade rep, author of the new book.
Maybe they would sue him. Maybe they would sue him.
Yeah, right. The new book from Robert Lighthizer, No Trade is Free, Changing Course, Taking on China, and Helping America's Workers. Robert Lighthizer, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
Before you see it on TV, share it on Facebook, or read about it in the paper. Hear it here first. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Hi, I'm Martha Stewart. Every year, more than 4 million pets enter shelters here in the United States. My friends at American